Do you guys know what European countries have called for the recognition of a Palestinian state? If you're watching this, you probably already know that Palestinians have been fighting for a state of their own for a long time. And while many argue that world leaders have not done enough to stop the illegal occupation and the expansion of illegal settlements, most nations around the world do formally recognize Palestine as a state. That is, most nations except for European and Western nations. In fact, it wasn't until 2014 that the first major European Western country recognized Palestine, and that country was Sweden. And then this year, Spain, Ireland, and Norway followed suit. Now, other Eastern European countries like Hungary, the Czech Republic, Romania, Poland, Slovakia, and Bulgaria were ahead of the curve, and they recognized Palestine in the 80s, specifically 1988. And Cyprus did as well, but they were not part of the European Union at that time. Now, recognizing Palestinian statehood has been controversial for European countries because of their strong economic ties with Israel, and many of them have believed that the peace process should be done between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and they just don't want to get involved. And then you have other Western countries like the US and Israel that go out of their way to tell nations not to recognize Palestine as a state, because if you do so, then you're going to disrupt the peace process and you'll be rewarding terror. Now, I find this ironic because both Israel and the United States were founded on both violence and terror, and they were both rewarded for that. So we know which countries recognize Palestine, but which countries are considering recognizing Palestine? As of May 2024, the countries that are considering recognizing Palestine include the UK, Finland, Malta, Australia, and Belgium. Now, the UK and Australia have said that they will consider Palestine as a state once the time is right and everything is negotiated, which is really not a new stance for either of them. And the president of Finland said that he will recognize Palestine at some point in the future. Now, when it comes to Belgium, it has been pretty unstable with its decision to recognize Palestine. Like, it was on the verge of doing so, and then there was controversy within the leadership. But Belgium was the first European country to call for a ceasefire, and they have repeatedly met with Palestinian leadership to work on creating a Palestinian state. And then we have Malta, which was ready to recognize Palestine as a state, but according to their press, they were pressured by the US and Israel not to do so. Now, in the grand scheme of things, these European countries are kind of late to the party, as a majority of the world has already recognized Palestine as a state way back in the 80s. And as of right now, at least 146 out of the 193 countries in the world recognize Palestine, meaning that about 75% of the world acknowledges Palestine as a state. It's very likely that that number will increase, especially as this matter gets more attention on the world stage and as more countries are pressured to take some action. Now, the question remains regarding the rest of Europe. Why do some countries act for Palestine or recognize Palestine while others don't? As of right now, 10 members of the 27 states in the European Union recognize Palestine. And I've said this before, the long-standing position that most of these Western and European countries have taken is that they want the Palestinians and the Israelis to settle this matter for themselves, and they want to see an established peace process before they can go ahead and publicly acknowledge Palestine as a state. However, a handful of nations have since changed their stance and have come out and recognized Palestine, including Spain, who is one of the 3 countries who recognized Palestine this year. And apparently they made this stance after the World Central Kitchen convoy was attacked by Israel. And it's also true that Spain has always had diplomatic ties with Arab nations, so this isn't very surprising. And Spain also does have a rich Muslim history. And then we have Norway. Now, Norway is not a part of the European Union, but it is one of the European countries who acknowledged Palestine as a state this year. And they said that they chose to do this because they recognize that there is no peace process and that the recognition of Palestine shouldn't happen at the end of peace negotiations. Rather, the recognition of a Palestinian state is what's going to lead and solidify peace in that region. And I completely agree. Now, Norway has been very instrumental in trying to establish peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. So I'm not surprised that they have decided to make this announcement alongside other European nations during this very, very violent time. Now, Ireland was also part of this trio of nations that recognize Palestine, and the Irish have long shown their solidarity with the Palestinians. In fact, Ireland was one of the first European countries to endorse Palestine as a state in the 1980s. Now, finally, we have Slovenia, who is another European nation that recognized Palestine this year, though they didn't do it at the same time as the other three nations I just mentioned. And their leadership also acknowledged that there is no peace process right now, and they made it a point that Slovenia has been waiting for their sovereignty for 1,000 years, and they only got it 33 years ago, and they recognize that Palestinians have not yet been given their right to sovereignty, inspiring their choice to recognize Palestine this year. We see all these countries recognizing a Palestinian state, but what have European countries done to push for Palestinian sovereignty? So actually in the 1980s, European countries signed something called the Venice Declaration. And in that declaration, they recognized the Palestinians' right to self-determination. Now, they even went as far as negotiating how they would distribute aid to the Palestinians so that they can establish a state and function on their own. But unfortunately, all that money went to waste as Israel destroyed a lot of the infrastructure that was created with the money from those European nations. And obviously, since then, Palestine was never formally acknowledged by the European Union as a state, despite the PLO's effort to show that they were in fact qualified to create a Palestinian state. Now, at this point in time, the EU has an office in Palestine. It's in Ramallah, which is in the West Bank. And the EU has been very insistent on adhering to the 1967 borders, and they have repeatedly condemned and deemed illegal Israeli settlements as illegal. Despite this, there are anywhere from 100 to 150 illegal Israeli settlements in Palestinian territories that house anywhere from 500,000 to 700,000 illegal Israeli settlers. Now, unfortunately, no country has been able to stop those settlements, but the EU has been very, very generous, I guess you can say, with distributing aid to the Palestinians, making them the highest donors of aid to the Palestinian territories, specifically the Palestinian Authority. Now, another effort that the EU has made to establish a Palestinian state was in 2014 when they signed a non-binding resolution deeming that Palestinians have the right to statehood, and they called on all countries to recognize the Palestinian state as well. Now, I've said this before, but I'll say it again. Spain has been very instrumental in maneuvering and touring to ensure that Palestinians receive their statehood, and teaming up with Norway and Ireland to announce it at the same time to make sure that it's more impactful than if only one of them was to say it by themselves. Now, I've also said this before, I believe that with the escalation of things, maybe more European countries will be pushed into action. However, I do not know. But I certainly do hope so. That pretty much sums up what the European Union and other European and Western countries have done for the Palestinians, who's involved, and who is likely next to take action. And, of course, if you want to read more about this, as always, I have left all sources in the comments.